A peasant of the early Middle Ages stands outside his hut, and behind its wooden walls, the most merciless winter the old men of the village can remember is playing out. The cold is creeping into every crevice, and his food supplies are rapidly melting away. His life is a constant battle with frost, hunger, and disease lurking in dark corners. Every day is a test, where not only strength and endurance are important, but also the ability to adapt, to seek warmth in a simple hut, to find food in forests and swamps, to protect his family and keep hope alive. What helped the peasant to survive in these most fierce winters, when nature seemed an enemy and death a constant shadow? Today you will learn the secrets that the chronicles kept silent about, how exactly ordinary people fought the cold, hunger, and fear. Welcome to a journey through time, where history comes alive through the fates of those who lived under conditions that seem to us harsh to the extreme. Shelter from the cold, a simple hut and its insulation. The peasant of the early Middle Ages knew that surviving the harsh winters meant building a house that would be his safe haven from the bitter cold. His hut was not just walls, but an elaborate insulation system built from natural materials available in his surroundings. The foundation was thick walls of clay mixed with straw and reeds. This mixture, known as mud masonry, was excellent at keeping heat inside the dwelling while protecting it from wind and dampness. This ancient method of construction had deep roots. It was used as far back as the Roman Empire and then passed down from generation to generation in Northern Europe. For additional insulation, moss was placed between the timbers or stones to act as a natural cold absorber, absorbing moisture and preventing it from penetrating inside. The moss also trapped cool air, creating an additional layer of protection. Doors and windows were closed tightly with hides, wool, or dense cloth to keep out icy gusts of wind. There was no glass in the dwelling, so these barriers were vital. Besides, a peasant did not live in a hut alone. The house became cramped because together with him under one roof were placed domestic animals: chickens, goats, pigs. The warm breath and bodies of these creatures raised the temperature of the air inside, creating a small microclimate that helped people to stay warm on the coldest nights. This was a common practice in Northern Europe, confirmed by archaeological findings and written sources from the 12th through 14th centuries. Excavations of medieval villages reveal the presence of animals in dwellings, which indicates the necessity of such neighborhood for survival. Thus, a simple peasant's hut was not just a dwelling, it was a carefully thought-out, multi-layered shield against cold, created by nature and the experience of ancestors. Only thanks to such skills and habits could a peasant endure the harsh trials of a harsh winter without losing hope for spring revival. Fire is the heart of home and survival. A peasant in the early Middle Ages understood, without fire, life was impossible, especially in cold winters when frost could cut to the bone. The art of making fire was one of the most important skills taught from childhood. There were no modern matches or lighters. Flint and a fire brick were used to make fire. By striking the flint against the iron, the peasant produced a spark, which was carefully brought to the dry trout. Thin blades of grass or bark, which quickly ignited. This procedure required patience and skill, for the mist meant to be left without heat and light. The stove was the center of the house, massive, made of clay and stones. It accumulated and evenly gave out heat for many hours. Through thick walls and ceilings, the heat from the stove warmed the whole house. Wealthier homes had open fireplaces around which the family gathered. The fire not only provided warmth and cooking opportunities, but also created an atmosphere of safety and comfort during the long winter evenings. However, with fire came a constant threat. The thatched roof, wooden walls, and hay were flammable materials. Peasants kept a strict watch over the hearth, keeping order around it to avoid accidental ignition. Chronicles often describe devastating fires in villages. They could destroy everything in one night, depriving people of shelter and food. For safety, stone or clay barriers were built near the hearth, and windows and doors were closed tightly in windy weather to prevent sparks from flying around the hut. This difficult balance between the benefits and dangers of fire was an everyday reality for the peasant. The ability to build, maintain, and control a fire was not just a household skill, but a matter of life and death in the harsh winters of the Middle Ages. Without fire, there would be no warmth, no food, and no hope of survival in the cold. Clothing and layering. For the peasant of the early Middle Ages, clothing was more than just protection from the cold. It was a vital survival tool. At that time, there were no modern insulators and synthetics, and each piece of cloth was handmade from available natural materials. The basis of the closet was wool. It was the main heat-saving material. Woolen fabrics were coarse but dense, and even if they got wet from rain or snow, their structure allowed them to retain body heat. In addition to wool, peasants used linen, which, although less insulating, was highly breathable and served as the basis for underwear. Flax helped to keep the skin dry and reduce the risk of hypothermia. Special attention was paid to layering. The peasant dressed in several layers, thin linen underwear, woolen shirts and pants on top, and thicker cloaks or jackets on top. This system allowed for temperature regulation. Layers were removed or added as needed, and soaked clothing was replaced as soon as possible to avoid colds and frostbite. Changing clothes was critical because the dampness and cold could lead to serious illnesses such as pneumonia and pneumonia. Hats made of felt or fur, were considered a necessary element because up to a third of heat was lost through the exposed parts of the body. Hats fit tightly around the head and covered the ears, protecting them from frostbite. Gloves were made of thick leather or fabric, often with a layer of fur inside. Hands were especially vulnerable to frost, and without reliable protection, a peasant could get frostbite, threatening to lose fingers. Shoes were made of thick leather, often lined with fur and stuffed with dry grass or straw for additional insulation. The shoes were fastened with straps to prevent snow and cold air from penetrating inside. Archaeological excavations and written sources confirm that the inhabitants of the northern and mountainous regions of Europe used just such a multi-layered approach to clothing. Without it, they could not endure the long winter months filled with frost and blizzards. This system of clothing became a veritable armor that kept the cold out, helping the peasant to stay healthy and strong in conditions where the slightest mistake could lead to death. It was this practical wisdom, passed down from generation to generation, that ensured survival in the harshest conditions of the early Middle Ages. Food in winter, what was preserved and how it was extracted. When winter covered the land with ice, the peasant faced the harsh task of providing food for his family when there was no fresh fruit and herbs at all. The whole year, the peasant's life was subordinated to preparations for this time. Dried and smoked foods occupied a central place in the winter diet. Meat and fish were first dried in the sun or in the smoke of the oven, a method that allowed food to be preserved for months without losing its nutritional properties. Smoking, common in the early Middle Ages, not only prolonged shelf life, but also gave food a special flavor so valuable in harsh conditions. The storage of stocks was ensured by underground storages, cellars and pits, which were lined with stones, covered with clay and insulated with straw and moss. Such constructions created an optimal microclimate. Coolness and humidity prevented spoilage of fruits and vegetables, and also prevented rodents from getting to the food. Root vegetables such as beets, turnips, carrots, onions, and garlic, as well as sauerkraut and other products capable of surviving a long winter, were stored in these underground vaults. Archaeological excavations of medieval settlements often reveal such cellars with the remains of vegetables, which confirms their importance in the diet of a peasant. Winter hunting and fishing, despite the cold and difficult conditions, remained an important part of survival. Nets and traps prepared in advance made it possible to catch hares, foxes, and other small animals. Hunting large animals was risky and required a concerted effort. On frozen rivers, they made ice holes where they caught fish, pike, perch, and burbot. These fish were not only food, but also a source of valuable animal fat, vital for warming the body. Medieval chronicles and travelers' records describe how peasants and fishermen desperately fought against winter conditions, preserving their lives and strength. Thus, winter nutrition for the medieval peasant was a carefully constructed system, from advanced preparation and storage to active extraction in winter conditions. This complex of knowledge and skills was a matter of life, handed down from generation to generation, and constituted one of the key elements of survival in a brutal era. Water and ice, how vital liquids were extracted and preserved. In the harsh winters of the Middle Ages, when the ground was covered with a thick layer of snow, Peasants faced the difficult task of how to provide clean and potable water without letting it freeze or become contaminated. Water was vital, but in icy conditions it was a real challenge to get it. Snow and ice became the main source of water in winter. Peasants went outside with wooden buckets or clay jugs, collected snow, trying to avoid polluted areas, because the purity of water directly affected the health of the family. In darkened huts, they melted snow on the hearths, turning it into liquid. But it was not easy to do this. Fuel and fire were highly valued, and it was necessary to spend them on melting snow sparingly and wisely. To keep water from freezing in wells and barrels, peasants used tricks known for centuries. Wells were covered with thick straw or tightly closed with wooden lids. Sometimes they put bags of wool or moss on top, natural insulators that retained heat. The technique of heating water with hot stones is known. Stones heated in the fire were carefully lowered into containers with water, which did not allow it to freeze completely. On frozen ponds or rivers, small areas with open water were kept open by maintaining them with the help of fire or constant movement. Clean drinking water was worth its weight in gold, because contaminated water could lead to deadly diseases such as dysentery, cholera, and other infections. In some regions, peasants were able to filter water through layers of sand, charcoal, and cloth to purify it of impurities. Sometimes water was boiled, although this was rarely done because of fuel shortages. Chronicles and medieval treatises show that lack of clean water caused widespread illness and death, especially in cold winters. Thus, extracting and conserving water in winter was not only a matter of everyday necessity, but also a constant struggle for survival. It required from the peasant observation, knowledge of natural laws, and ability to use improvised materials to keep himself and his relatives alive in the fiercest frosts. Hygiene and health during the winter months. During the winter months, life for the medieval peasant became even harsher due to the limited ability to maintain hygiene. Washing was often a real luxury. Water was icy, and heat in the hut was scarce. Washing was reduced to a quick wipe with a rag or snow, because prolonged contact with cold water threatened severe colds or even pneumonia. Unlike in later eras when baths became a mass phenomenon, in the early Middle Ages they were practically inaccessible to ordinary peasants, and this had serious consequences for their health. In winter, the risk of respiratory and skin diseases increased dramatically due to constant hypothermia and contact with dirt and parasites. Folk healers relied on primitive but centuries-tested recipes. Sage and chamomile decoction served to gargle the throat and relieve inflammation, honey and garlic, to strengthen the immune system and fight infections. Mustard compresses and fat rubs were widely used in the villages to keep warm and improve circulation. Frostbite was a serious threat, especially to the hands, feet, and face. They were treated by gradual warming, wrapping the affected areas with woolen cloths, using hot stones and moss soaked in fat to relieve pain and speed up tissue recovery. Historical chronicles and ethnographic evidence show that even bloodletting, a method that today seems cruel, was used in an attempt to relieve swelling and inflammation, although it often led to complications. A separate problem is the fight against parasites. In winter, when clothes and bodies were not changed often, lice and fleas caused a lot of suffering. Peasants resorted to burning infested clothes, frequent rinsing of clothes in hot water, if they managed to light a fire long enough, and smoking out dwellings with the smoke of bonfires, measures that somehow reduced infestation. Although primitive, these measures helped to avoid mass diseases and epidemics. Hygiene during the winter months is not just a matter of comfort, but a key element of survival. Without a constant battle against cold, mud, and disease, even the most resilient peasants could not survive the long winters. Historical evidence shows that it was this folk knowledge and practices, passed down from generation to generation, that underpinned the resilience of medieval communities in harsh climatic conditions. Social connections and helping neighbors. During the harsh winter months, the medieval peasant knew that solitary survival was rare and almost impossible. The whole village became a single organism, where everyone was bound to each other not only by ties of kinship, but also by a common struggle against cold, hunger, and disease. Sharing resources, especially firewood and food supplies, was vital. Sometimes even the poorest shared the last piece of bread or log, realizing that the saved strength and fire was a salvation for all. In Chronicles, there are stories about how entire villages came to the aid of those who lost their homes due to fire or strong winds. Mutual aid was also manifested in physical labor. Building and repairing houses, especially before winter, was always a collective endeavor. Peasants gathered together to repair the roof, strengthen the walls, and build a stove that could hold heat. Such joint construction not only saved time and effort, but also strengthened ties, turning neighbors into true allies. Historians note that many village traditions were built on such shared efforts. From plowing the land to building defenses, community gatherings and winter festivals played an equally important role. In the evenings, when work stopped, people gathered to discuss news, exchange knowledge about curing illnesses, and share experiences. Holidays such as Christmas or winter pagan rituals were a source of joy and encouragement. They filled hearts with hope and helped to forget the harsh conditions. These gatherings boosted morale and made us forget the fear of cold and death. As a result, in the conditions of harsh winters, when every day could be the last, it was social ties, community solidarity, and mutual assistance that became the main resource for survival. Without them, the peasant was doomed to loneliness and death. But together with neighbors, they created a strong shield against adversity, which helped to overcome the harshest trials. Activity limitation and survival in deficit conditions. For the medieval peasant, winter was a severe test of patience and the ability to conserve energy. With the arrival of cold and snow came a time of limited activity. The ground froze, food supplies dwindled, and the risk of injury or illness increased. The peasant realized that it was deadly to waste energy unnecessarily. Therefore, daily chores were reduced to the bare necessities, and all heavy work, plowing, collecting firewood, repairs, was postponed until warmer times. Minimizing physical exertion helped to reduce the risk of hypothermia and injuries, which were almost impossible to treat in winter conditions. Sometimes peasants would sit by the stove for hours, warming themselves and regaining their strength in order to stay healthy until spring. Chronicles and folktales mention how families managed to survive thanks to the ability to slow down and take care of themselves. Psychological preparation was equally important. Winter lasted for months, and in harsh years, the cold and hunger stretched almost indefinitely. The peasant learned not to give in to despair, drawing strength from familiar rituals and faith to survive the dark days. The memory of past hardships, stories of the old people, and community support helped to keep his composure. Historians note that periods of long and cold winters in Europe, especially during the Little Ice Age, 14th to 19th centuries, forced peasant communities to develop strategies of economy, not only of material, but also of vital energy. This is what allowed many to survive despite the constant challenges of nature and society. Thus, surviving winter scarcity is the art of knowing how to limit ourselves, conserve our strength, and keep our spirits up to wait for spring and new opportunities. Outdoor survival techniques, hunting and gathering food in winter. In the coldest months, when the house became cramped and supplies were rapidly running low, the peasant was forced to go out into the winter nature to get a little extra food. This was not easy. Winter hunting and gathering roots, berries, or nuts required not only physical endurance, but also a deep knowledge of the behavior of wild animals and plants that could survive under the snow. Improvised traps were one of the main methods of prey. From improvised materials, twigs, roots, hemp ropes, they made the simplest loops and snares capable of capturing a hare, fox, or partridge. These traps, although seemingly primitive, were ingenious and effective. Archaeological finds confirm that such structures were already used in the early Middle Ages in Europe, and the skills to make them were passed down from generation to generation. The peasants carefully studied the habits of wild animals. They could read tracks in the snow, notice where the animal most often went to the water or hid from the wind. This observation allowed them to place traps in the most successful places and hunt with maximum results. Winter chronicles often mention that the ability to talk to nature was considered an important part of survival, almost like a language that had to be mastered. But winter hunting was associated with dangers. Severe frosts, blizzards, and deep snow made a walk through the forest a risky venture. Peasants could get frostbite, get lost, or run into a wolf pack. Records of those times tell of people sitting in shelters for hours hiding from the weather or enduring the cold to avoid missing their prey. In such conditions, only the most hardy and prepared survived. In addition to hunting, harvesting winter wild fruits, roots, berries, and nuts was important for sustenance. Much of it could be found under the snow or in coastal thickets where the plants were protected from frost. This seasonal gathering of food required knowledge and experience, as it was easy to confuse the edible with the poisonous. Thus, the ability to find food outside the house is not just a part of peasant life, but a living legend of man's constant struggle with nature. In the conditions of the early Middle Ages, where every winter could be the last, it was these skills that helped to survive and keep hope for spring. General psychology of survival, faith, tradition, and hope. In the world of the early Middle Ages, where harsh winters brought hunger, disease, and loneliness, the peasant could not rely on physical endurance alone. His main stronghold became faith, not just a religious belief, but a vital necessity in psychological defense. Prayer every morning and evening was more than a ritual. It was an attempt to keep in touch with something higher, to ask for strength and protection from adversity. Holidays and common church services brought the village together, fostering a sense of community and mutual support. Without these traditions, many people would not be able to endure the hardships of everyday life. Religious rituals were often accompanied by simple but profound rituals: fumigation with herb smoke, signs of the cross before starting work or during illness. These actions gave the peasant a sense of control in a world full of chaos and danger. Folk chronicles often mention how prayers for health and harvest were repeated hundreds of times, like incantations that could ward off death and famine. Stubbornness and steadfastness are the key traits of a peasant. It was not just a habit, but a necessity developed over centuries. Everyone who survived was ready to fight for life to the last breath. When neighbors died of disease or hunger, the weak could not stand, but the strong became a living symbol of hope for the whole community. Folk songs and legends reflected this very struggle, celebrating the heroes who rose up despite the cold, pain, and loss. They continued to sow fields, care for their children, and believe in the best, even though death and destruction reigned around them. Fear was a constant companion, but faith helped to cope with it. Amulets made of wood and iron, crosses and horseshoes on doors. All this was not just decoration, but an important part of psychological defense against evil spirits and misfortune. These symbols strengthened the spirit and created a sense of security. People believed that observing prohibitions and traditions could change fate, which was sometimes more powerful than all the knowledge about the world. Finally, hope was the most important resource. It gave meaning to suffering and the strength to go on living, even when death seemed inevitable. Faith, tradition, and stubbornness created a unique alloy without which the peasant of the Middle Ages could not have survived. It was not just a struggle for bread, but a struggle to preserve himself, his clan, and his culture. It was this inner resilience that helped to face each new day and survive the coldest and bleakest winter. The life of a medieval peasant is not just a story about fighting cold and hunger. It is a story of fortitude, traditions that have been passed down from generation to generation, and the ability to find light even in the darkest conditions. Surviving the harsh winters of the time required not only dexterity and labor, but also strong faith, community support, and endless perseverance. Every detail, from the simplest clothing to the most elaborate rituals, was part of a larger mosaic that helped keep life and hope alive. If you are fascinated by the history of the Middle Ages, survival, and mysteries of the past, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Here you'll find new deep dives into the lives of bygone eras, lively stories, and fascinating reconstructions. Stay tuned to learn even more about how people overcame the challenges of time and created their world. Your journey into history is just beginning.